Because we're in for a real treat. I'm so glad all of you are here in person and online. And I'm thrilled that it's not only people from the Women's Spirituality group, but also from Joshua's Bible study, because I'm a newbie to Bible study, and every time we meet, Joshua blows my mind. I feel like my head is spinning when I leave, and all I do is blabber. I'm so ignorant. I'm so ignorant. Anyway, I met Joshua probably about 5 years ago at St. Martin's, probably in morning prayer, or perhaps Wednesday morning Eucharist, and knew that he was incredibly well versed in everything about the Bible and Judaism, but I'm amazed at how little I know about all of the ways that he is so well versed in everything. So, everything, absolutely everything. Anyway, I'm thrilled that you're all here, and I'm very thrilled, Joshua, that you are here. We're going to start differently from how we normally start. Usually we start with a circle of introduction. We'll do that at the end, I think. It's based on what Joshua wants to do. So right now, as we are getting ready to start our program, I'm going to symbolically strike the match to light the flame of our candle, which I always do to start the program. I don't know where I put it. So just assume that it is lit, and just shut my eyes for a minute and welcome the Holy Spirit to our gathering.
I'm Joshua. This presentation is sort of a revisiting of a lot of my graduate work that I did when I was studying at Hebrew College. I spent a lot of my time, I was supposed to be studying modern Jewish spirituality because at that time I thought I was going to become a rabbi. And I spent a lot of my time actually studying ancient Israelite religion because I had access to that study all of a sudden, and I was really interested in it. And so this is sort of going back to those studies and sort of revisiting some of those themes and what I've taken out of that as I've gone along. Some of this will seem really controversial, and some of it will probably be really exciting to the Women's Spirituality group. Here's some ground rules. Hold your questions. There'll be multiple breaks in the presentation to ask questions. You can write it down. You can jot it down on your phone. But it's very difficult for me to hold focus when questions are flying. If you've come to Bible study on Tuesday night, you know what that's like. So we'll pause for questions in between sections. People who are on Zoom, you can just pop questions into the chat at any time, and I'll go back to the chat when it comes time for questions. And we can't cover everything. The topic that we're covering today is immense. The ancient Near East is the best studied place and time in all of human studies. So there's so much material and there's so much information that we could dive into. This is basically a superficial overview of what's possible to learn about this. And then if you want to learn more, there's lots of good resources. I brought 3 books with me that you could take a look at to think about if you're interested in diving deeper. So we have 4 sections today. We're going to talk about who the Israelite goddesses were. We're going to talk about how they are visible beneath the surface of the text of the Bible. And then we're going to talk about how they have resurfaced in Jewish and Christian spirituality. And then in the final section, the journey continues, what to do about that, which is probably the most difficult question. So let's dive right into the Israelite goddesses. So our archaeological evidence suggests, and that's the correct way to say that, right? We don't know really what these religions were like in the ancient Near East, Canaanite religion, Israelite religion, whatever that means. That could mean a lot of different things. we don't know what those things are really like, but the evidence suggests that that Yahweh and Asherah were worshipped by ancient Israelites as a pair, side by side. We could call that duotheistic, that they had two gods, a male and a female god, and they called them Yahweh and Asherah. But they also probably worshipped many other gods. They worshipped some Egyptian gods, they worshipped some Babylonian gods, and at different times and different places, Israelites have sort of picked up deities from other nations as well. But we shouldn't think of these as foreign deities that they took in. That is, in fact, the narrative of the Bible, but it's not the historical fact. So we're going to split out a little bit historical fact from biblical narrative in this presentation. So they are Israelite deities germane to Israelite worship. And the narrative of the Hebrew Bible mostly confirms this. It's not controversial to say that ancient Israelites worshipped a bunch of different gods, because the Bible said that they did, and it's really upset about that. So it's good evidence that that is part of the story. And the Hebrew Bible was also a part of an attempted purge of the worship of other deities in ancient Israel. And so we see in the Hebrew Bible a kind of transition from one sort of iteration of Israelite religion to another that will eventually become Judaism. But there's a long journey between those two things. The Bible is an incredible text, a really unique text, because it really records that transitional period between polytheism and monotheism for the people of Israel. It's also worth noting, this is a map of ancient Israel and Judah, and this is the divided kingdoms of ancient Israel and Judah post-Solomon, when the kingdom split in half. So the northern kingdom was called Israel, with its capital in Samaria or Shomron, and the southern kingdom was Judah, with its capital at Yerushalayim or Jerusalem. And you can see the other kingdoms around. And so mostly these reforms, this attempted purge, is the Judahite people who become the Jews, that those words are related, Judahite, Jewish, right? Related words. Those people are really sort of the ones who are spearheading the purge, and the kingdom of Israel in the north is really fine with all of their gods. That's kind of the drama that emerges between the two kingdoms, where the Judahite kingdom is sort of trying to unite the people with one single deity, whereas the Israelites are kind of pushing back against that. Massive oversimplification for like a 3-century period of time, but that's kind of the drama behind the text that we're looking at. And you're going to want to remember that Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom as we move forward. So, Israelite goddesses, how do we know? Here's some of the physical evidence, or we would say the material evidence for this. This is a stone vessel from Kuntilet Arjud, which is in the north of the Sinai Peninsula. So between Egypt and Israel today, there's like a triangle of desert landscape, and that's Sinai. And so in the northern part of that tract of land, this was found. And up at the top, you can barely see it. There's 2 lines of text here. Well, that is Paleo-Hebrew. That's what Hebrew looked like before it adopted the Aramaic letters, thank God. If you think Hebrew is hard to read now, it was a lot harder then, I think. But this is what it says. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. And so Yahweh is being identified with the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel here, with those rebel folks who still worship all those gods, and his Asherah. So there's not just Yahweh and Asherah, we picked these 2 random folks to bless you by, but Yahweh and his Asherah, as if to say that they really go together. They are in a pair. I don't have a picture of it, but there's also an ancient temple complex that has been discovered in the north of Israel, where there are 2 altars set up next to each other, and the assumption there is that they were set up for Yahweh and Asherah. Hers is a little bit smaller, but we can talk about sexism in the ancient world at a different time. Okay. So here's a close-up. What do we notice about the figures? What do you think about them? Which one's Yahweh? Which one's Asherah? And how do you know? And what's going on in this? Is this a picture? Is it a letter? What's happening? This part's interactive. Susan.
Yahweh has phallus and Asherah has breasts.
Which one are you saying is Asherah?
The smaller one with the breasts visible.
Okay.
And
So
I think that Yahweh is the larger one with the phallus.
okay, so Yahweh has a phallus hanging down, so we would say that's probably him. And Asherah, who seems to have two little circle breasts there, I sort of idealized artistically, we would say, is to the side of Yahweh. That leaves out who is in the background playing a harp, maybe. And she, I think, also has two circles representing her breasts on the right side, and so maybe she's a female worshiper, maybe she's Asherah, and this is a male attendant. Not really. It's kind of unclear who each of the figures is. I think certainly the main, most central, and most sort of large figure is Yahweh. I'm not sure which one is Asherah. Yeah.
Could Asherah be in the form of an animal?
Certainly, and it really gives us pause that the cow who's feeding her calf here is a cow, right? Is not a bull, right? It's a cow, and so because the cow is female, maybe that is the representation actually of Asherah. Anything else from folks? Yeah. Sorry?
What is on the upper left?
If you find out, they'll give you a doctorate. Yeah. Yeah. Even the text that I read to you earlier, it was reconstructed, right? Like there's lots of words missing there, and we can use our imagination and what else we know of the culture to make guesses, but some things are just lost. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this image?
Markings are not the script at the top, but also markings are those like letters or language or something other.
I think that they're letters. This is Paleo-Hebrew letters here for sure. I'm not sure about the other ones because they're a little bit too loosey-goosey and they're not organized. This might actually say Yahweh, which is an older form of the name Yahweh, but I don't remember. And so that seems to be organized language. This seems to be not so much. But a lot of what we find with ancient artifacts is that we have like practice tablets from scribes and artists. You know, we don't think about this when we think about archaeology, that we're going to find the things that weren't actually meant to be seen. So we do have to ask the question, like, did someone make this on purpose this way with these things, or were they like, here's Yahweh and Asherah, and here's a cow, and I'm just practicing, and I'm going to practice my letters on the side. You know, it's unclear to us. We don't really know the purpose of this object.
Wouldn't it be more likely to be practicing if we were on just
yeah, not on stone. Yeah. This is on stone. So yeah, so it being stone does decrease the likelihood that it's an unintentional or not a public facing object for sure. Yes. Mary Jane. Interesting. Yeah. So is this an offering? It could be a representation of the deity. There's a lot of different possibilities. Okay. Yes.
I'm interested in particular with, God is represented like forward facing and then you have like behind them, maybe someone in the temple cult or worshiper, and then like the aliens are interesting relations with each other as well. So I'm just wondering if there's
I can't imagine that there isn't. We have this prejudice that is a hangover from the Renaissance that like ancient people didn't understand perspective. But just because they represented it differently doesn't mean that they didn't understand it. And so, in medieval religious art, Jesus is often represented really large with all the disciples as like little tiny people next to him because Jesus is more important. That's the artist's way of being like, this is the central figure and these people are auxiliary figures. So it's possible that the size difference is significant in that way. But it's hard not to look at this harp player, whether she's a shera or a worshiper bringing an offering of music. It's hard not to see that and go, that's actually perspective, right? Like she's in the background, and almost 3D actually. It's interesting how even though it's in profile where the chair is sort of under her this way and she's sitting with her legs to the side, there's a kind of really like there's depth to it that we don't expect, but that expectation is a prejudice, not a reality. Yeah. Okay. The mother-in-law, yes. Yes, the mother-in-law of Yahweh and Asherah. Uh-huh. Or maybe it's the person who the blessing's written to. I mean, there's so many possibilities. Okay, one more. Where's my? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good idea actually, because now you can see where it's all positioned, and we're really missing so much, right? It's not just a little bit.
Is that horses at the beginning of the alphabet?
It might be. It wouldn't be surprising if there were horses coming in from the upper left because horses are one of the symbols that these goddesses actually take on over time. Possibly, yeah.
They've got some kind of parts.
Mhm. Okay, let's move on. So, wait, did I skip too many? Keep going. What do you notice? You got all of them. Okay, so Asherah is also not the only goddess that we're going to be talking about today, and it's actually hard to pick apart the goddesses of ancient Israel because they were often conflated with each other, and later religious people, the later worshippers of these goddesses, often did kind of smush them together at various times in various ways. And this happens all the time in the ancient world. Jupiter and Zeus are not the same deity. Jupiter and Zeus are not the same deity, but the Romans thought that their Jupiter was the Roman version of Zeus. And we just accepted that as a society. But the Greeks wouldn't necessarily have looked at that and said, oh, yes, of course. They would have said, no, we have other stories. So in the same way, Asherah and Astarte are not the same goddess in the ancient world, but later they come to be conflated and sort of smushed together. So we'll talk about Astarte, we'll talk about Anat, we'll talk about Hadad a little bit, who's called Baal in the Bible. There are actually a lot of Baals or Baalim in the Bible, but the one that's referenced most frequently and most antagonistically is Baal Hadad, the Thunderer. We'll talk about El, who's the father god of wisdom in the Canaanite pantheon, and El in Hebrew just means God. So it was a name, right? It's not just a title. And there were many, many others. We're going to focus today on the big three, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, and they were often conflated into one goddess. So Anat is the goddess of hunting and war. She's a goddess of sex, but not of fertility. We're used to, from classical anthropology, hearing that every goddess is a goddess of fertility. That's misogyny. So Anat is a goddess who's associated with sex, but not procreation. And actually, there are plenty of ancient peoples who did not see procreation as the only purpose of sex. So we're not going to project that onto them, especially if you read anything about Ishtar. It gets very saucy. She is associated with horns because of some of the things that happen in the Bible, and also probably because altars in that time period had horns, including the altar in Jerusalem. She's the sister of Baal, or maybe the consort of Baal. It's hard to tell sometimes what the family relationships are between these people, and sometimes they overlap. And she maybe assists Baal in conquering Motu, who is the god of death. So Baal conquers death in his in his myth cycle. And if you're a Christian, that should, send off some alarm bells, right? Like, okay, what is going on here? Okay, Astarte, who's also called in Canaanite, is called Aftart or Aftartu. Also Ashtoret and Ashtarot in Hebrew, or Ashtaroth in Anglicized Hebrew. She is mentioned many times in the Bible. She is also war and sex, power, authority, healing, lions and horses. So we have the horses there. Likely she's a West Semitic version of, I won't say the same deity, but version of Ishtar or Inanna. Ishtar being Babylonian, Inanna is Sumerian. And there's a great book called Inanna where you can read the reconstructed mythology of Inanna and Ishtar by some scholars, maybe 30 years ago published that. It's quite there's some parts of it that are outdated now, but it's very good if you just want to read some of the stories, and that's where you get the saucy stories about Ishtar. And just, you can't just pass that by, you have to give sources. And then we'll have Asherah. In Ugaritic, she's called Athiratu or Rabat Athirat Yam. We actually don't know what this means, but comparing it to Hebrew, it probably means Lady Sea Treader or maybe Lady Dawn Treader. And so walking on water is a theme that we see emerge quite frequently in ancient Near Eastern mythologies. She's also called Kadesh, or Holy One, Elat, which is just simply the feminine form of El, so goddess, Baalat, the feminine form of Baal, so lady instead of Lord, and she's often associated with snakes and trees, especially at the same time. Now that you know that, you will never read Genesis the same way again. When you have a snake in a tree, you have a veiled allusion to Asherah. She's the mother of the gods in the Canaanite pantheon, and probably the early consort of Yahweh in the Israelite pantheon. This is a mold of Anat on the left, and there's two pieces here. This is the actual mold that was found at Tel Kapnaim in northern Israel, and this is 700 years before the Bible was written, right? So this is way, way, way back. And this is a modern impression made with this mold so that you can see how it actually works. It's probably a nut, but again, because of the conflation of all these goddesses, we don't necessarily know who's who all the time. We have another mold next to it, which has been used to make a modern bronze statue. That's a modern bronze statue made with an ancient mold. And this is probably Astarte because of the horns. Again, Astarte is the best we can do with a question mark. And again, 1,000 years before the Bible was written here. And so there's a long tradition here that the Bible is talking about. Here is a Judahite example from around the time the Bible was written. This, to me, is just like when you kick out the old guard, you kick out the arts too. Like, this is what your goddess statue looks like after you try to purge her cult. You get a little Asherah figurine. She's emphasizing the breasts, as we've heard through the poem at the beginning and on the stone vessel as well. So we can identify that pretty confidently as Asherah, right around the time the Bible starts to become a thing, the Hebrew Bible, that is. And this probably was a home figurine. It's very likely that even after the monotheization of Israelite religion in Judah, women would keep a cult of Asherah in their homes with their children, and the kids would sort of grow up with the cult of Asherah until they were 3 to 5, and then they would be taken off to learn about the cult of Yahweh, and never mind all that wives' tale stuff. Next, we have a bronze Astarte, and this example stands out from the rest of them. It's very different from the other examples because it's from very far away. It's from southern Spain, actually. But I want you to see the kind of the breadth that these traditions have. Remember that the Phoenicians colonized the entire Mediterranean, right? And so they brought with them the worship of Astarte, who looks very Egyptian in this example, probably as a result of Egyptian conquests of the Levant. They take on some of that styling. But this is a really fine example of Astarte, represented in a sort of pseudo-Egyptian style, but it is a Phoenician work. Okay. Yes.
the fact that these figurines and so on have been fairly recently discovered, a real archaeological find that, as I read it, seemed to reflect how much longer polytheistic beliefs lasted in the Holy Land than was commonly put out there, but I could have completely wrong.
I think that, to be really throwing gas on the fire here, I think we tend to think about history as this was a time period of polytheism. It ended, and then monotheism continued. And that's just not the way human life works. I don't think it's appropriate to necessarily even say that Israelite polytheism ended. It changed, and our ideas about God have changed as later, through 3,000 years of development, Judaism and Christianity have moved from this to what we have now. But to say that this ended and then Judaism started is similar to saying, well, then Judaism ended and Christianity began. Like, we don't say that anymore, right? So it really didn't.
That I was faced with, namely that the monotheistic belief among Jews was that it had emerged earlier than it really did. And of course, you're right, it's a long time process to do.
Well, and the worship of Yahweh is very ancient, but it comes from the probably southern Arabian desert tribes, and they brought it up with them into Israel. So it's not even the worship of Yahweh isn't even a native cult, which is why it's so controversial in the Bible, because the Canaanites are seeing the worship of Yahweh as a foreign deity coming in and usurping their tradition, essentially. And so he's and also Yahweh sort of takes on this imagery of these other deities that he probably didn't have before coming up from the desert. And so there's going to be a few moments in this presentation where you're sort of like, oh, there it is again. It didn't actually go anywhere, right? The practices have changed, but the people are the same. So. Someone on Zoom asked, how was the Astarte statue identified as Astarte? Total honesty, I don't know. I think that in this particular instance, because first of all, this is a beautifully intact statue, scholars who know a lot more about Phoenician religion than I do probably looked at that and said, yeah, that's Astarte. It might be her posture, it might be where she was found. I don't have the enough information to say confidently. Okay, so let's look beneath the surface, starting with some biblical texts. So we understand that the Bible rejects the worship of these goddesses and all other deities than Yahweh. But some of these texts are problematic in a way that actually calls into question the motives of the author of the text. So does the author of the text want to push the cult out, or is something else going on? And there are also some problems with very early texts about Yahweh that make us question what's going on with Yahweh? Like, do we actually understand Yahweh as an ancient Israelite God who was masculine and male and, thundering and angry? Or are there things going on that are sort of riding beneath the surface and relating to these other religious orientations? And it also we also call into question, looking very closely at the Bible, the singular nature of Yahweh. There's an assumption that the Hebrew Bible is very firmly monotheistic. There's one God, that's it. He's a person and is discrete. But really, there's more going on beneath the surface with that as well. And then there's the question of where the goddesses went, as usual, and there are some texts that actually take some of the aspects of the goddesses and conflate them with Yahweh. When we look at ancient religion, we're used to seeing a bunch of male gods smushed together, right? Like Amun-Re is actually the conflation of two Egyptian gods, Jupiter and Zeus conflation, right? We're not used to seeing male and female deities smushed together, But it seems like when you have monotheism, there's nowhere for the female deities to go, so they get smushed into the one God. And we'll see some examples of that too. So let's talk about motive, and we're going to start with this passage from Jeremiah. He is rebuking the Jews in exile for continuing their worship, probably of Astarte. As for you, do not pray for this people. This is God speaking to Jeremiah. Do not pray for this people. Do not raise a cry or prayer on their behalf. And do not intercede with me, for I will not hear you. Do not see what they are doing in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And they pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. Is it I whom they provoke, says the Lord? Is it not themselves to their own hurt? Therefore, thus says the Lord God, my anger and my wrath shall be poured out on this place, on humans and animals, on the trees of the field, and the fruit of the ground. It will burn and not be quenched. Ironically, in this passage, Yahweh is using an image for wrath, pouring out wrath, that actually comes directly from the stories of Anat, where she pours out a glass of wine on the table of El. And so, as God is saying, hey, don't do this thing, it's really bad, I'm very angry, God directly uses a metaphor from one of the goddesses that he's telling people not to worship. Okay, what's really weird about this passage if you're trying to get people to not worship the goddess, though?
Not worship.
Yeah, if you don't want people to worship the goddess, you don't want people to worship the Queen of Heaven, what's weird? You're telling them how to do it. This passage is giving the instructions for the rite. Okay, so is that instructions? The text clearly rejects the worship of the Queen of Heaven, who's likely Anat I put here. Okay, you have to think about that one. But it's also ironically preserving the steps. Gather wood, kindle a fire, knead dough, make cakes for the Queen of Heaven, pour out drink offerings. That's the order that it goes in. And not only that, but there are family roles associated with each of the steps, which suggests to us that this isn't just some sort of poetic parallelism, right? It's like, oh, actually, what the children do for the Queen of Heaven festival is they gather the wood. And what the fathers do is they kindle the fire. And the women are in charge of the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And then they, assuming all of them together, or perhaps just the women, pour out drink offerings to other gods. So it's really strange that the author here of Jeremiah is giving instructions for how to worship the Queen of Heaven as he's telling everyone not to do that. This theme is repeated in Jeremiah 44, where Jeremiah is speaking to Jews in exile in Egypt, and he says, don't do all this stuff. And again, it gives this list of things that they're doing and who's in charge of each part, and he sort of blames the wives for leading their husband astray. And the wives say, do you think that we did this without our husband's knowledge? Like, they kind of throw it back at Jeremiah. It's a really interesting passage. Okay, so the big question here is this really accidental, or is there intent to preserve the cult in some way within the text that is rejecting it? So now let's talk about the Lord alone. And of course, wherever you see the Lord in the Bible, that's Yahweh. We know that, yes, okay. God is a bachelor, promise. Okay, so Deuteronomy says this. This is a speech by Moses to the people of Israel. As an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, as it spreads its wings, takes them up and bears them aloft on its pinions, that's like the corners of the wings, the Lord alone guided him, meaning Israel or Jacob. No foreign god was with him. I promise, God was alone. I'm really serious, God was alone. Nobody else was there. He thinks he doth protest too much. Okay. So then, one chapter later, same speech by Moses, we get this. Yahweh appears like this in Deuteronomy 33. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. With him were myriads of holy ones. At his right, a host of his own. This is the NRSV UE, the translation that you hear really in church. And it's okay, but God is not alone a chapter later. There's a myriad of holy ones and a host of his own, whatever that means. So the problem isn't really the holy ones, right? God has angels. That doesn't mean they're not God, they're not other gods, right? That's kind of complicated actually, but whatever. We're used to that. The problem is that we have no idea what the Hebrew of this text means at all. Like we just don't know what it means. This translation, "at his right, a host of his own," is actually a correction that's inserted in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So this idea that it means this comes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, which says "ek dexion autou angeloi metautou," that at his dexterous, right? Dexion is right. Angeloi, like messengers, and that's where we get the word angel from, of his own for himself. And so this is a Greek insertion. We still don't know what the Hebrew means. The Hebrew is me revavot kodesh mimino eshdat lamo. And eshdat is the word they're translating here to be a host of his own in the Greek. So literally it says, from hosts of the holy at his right, eshdat for him, and we just don't know what that word means. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible. So even the scribe, the Masorete, who copied this down and fixed the official text of the Bible, is perplexed, and that's why we have the word eshdat here, and then repeated in brackets, because the scribe is telling you, I have no idea what this is, but if you split it into 2 words, it kind of makes sense. That's what that is. That's a scribal note from the 700s Common Era, letting us know how to read that. In Hebrew, it's called Krei Kativ, reading versus writing, where you write the Bible with eshdat as one word. When you're reading the Bible out loud in the synagogue, you say eshdat, 2 words. They each have their own musical note when it's being chanted. They're separated out. And they take it from the word eshdat, which we have no idea, and they split it into the words for fire, ish, and dat, law. And those are nice monotheistic Jewish concepts, right? We can deal with that. We can deal with the fire of God's law at his right side. Never mind the theological problem that what is the fire of God's law? Is that another person? Like, we're not really sure. It's still a problem, though, because the Masoretes were writing in 700 AD, right? So this version of the Hebrew Bible comes from 1400 years after this text was written down, never mind originated. And so they think that the word dot is Hebrew. It's not. It's a Persian word. And this text is way too old to have Persian loanwords in it. So it still doesn't really solve the problem. Well, yes, this is really all of Deuteronomy is a speech by Moses. It's just his restatement of the Torah. But in Hebrew, it's called Dvarim, which means words. Super helpful title. And in Greek, Deuteronomy means second law. So it's telling us it's a repeat of the Torah. And so, yeah, so this is Moses giving the speech. But the text itself, like this part of Moses' speech in Deuteronomy 32 and 33-ish, that's a really ancient Hebrew text that probably predates the rest of the Torah. And so really the story has been written as a frame to hold this ancient text that probably already existed. Here's the word eshdat again. And I'm not going to tell you what this word is, but I want you to notice how similar they are. Can you see the difference between them, and can you see the similarity between them? So eshdat, right? You have the dalet is the 3rd letter. It goes like this way, right? Eshdat. This is the d and the t. But if you just if you sort of just rounded the corner here, you get this letter. And if you just opened up the top here, you would get this letter. Or more likely, what the scribes had was this word, and they closed the gap to make it a tav, and they gave what I call common students the dent, dalet with a dent. They gave a dent to this letter to make it into a dalet. So they didn't remove the original word from the text, they just wrote it a little different. The second word is Asherah. Oh, so they took the name of Asherah in this text that they inherited, probably from a very ancient Israelite source, and they just wrote over it with dot. And maybe now Asherah is gone from the text, and the text doesn't really make sense, but they have removed God's consort, God's wife, from the text of the Torah, in one of the few places where she had still remained. So if we amend the text to keep this in mind, that the text, the original Hebrew we have, which is, by the way, a myth, there's no such thing as the original Hebrew text of the Bible. We can talk about that another time, but there aren't original texts of anything. That's not really how literature works. If we consider for a second that the text we have now of the Hebrew Bible is a correction, and we reverse the correction, this is what the verse would say. Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. With him were myriads of holy ones. At his right, his Asherah. Remember this base. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. His Asherah. So the text is even using the same structure of Yahweh and his Asherah in this example. Okay, so again, where did they go? And the answer is nowhere. They're still right there, hiding under a textual correction, hiding behind assertions of monotheism that maybe got ahead of themselves a little bit. And sometimes the answer is they went into Yahweh, that Asherah became part of Yahweh by conflation. For a rare example in the ancient world, a goddess and a god get smushed together regardless of gender, which leads to some really weird gender things going on in the Bible. And when weird gender things are involved, you know I will be very close by. This section is called Yahweh Does What? You have to say it like that. So here's Deuteronomy 32:18. Notice how close that is to those other texts that we just talked about, right? This comes a few verses after the very verse where Asherah is deleted by scribes from Deuteronomy. So in Hebrew it says, Sur Yiladcha Tesi, Batishach El Mecholelecha. And the KJV has this, and you're going to be like, Joshua, why are you telling us what the KJV says? Who cares? But it's interesting to see the change in the English text, how much scholars have really labored over how to translate this verse. Of the rock that begat thee, thou art unmindful and hast forgotten God that formed thee. Formed thee. I wasn't formed personally. I came out bloody and screaming, and I was 10 pounds, so. The NRSV UE that we hear in church says, you were unmindful of the rock that bore you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. Who gave you birth? Yahweh is a male deity. How does he give birth? We saw his schlong in the vase. How does he give birth with that? So closer, fine. This is a contemporary contemporary Jewish translation from the Jewish Publication Society, the JPS, and it says, you neglected the rock who begot you, forgot the God who labored to bring you forth. And this is the closest modern translation we have, but it's still not good enough for me. Because we have other examples of these verbs in Hebrew. The verb for begetting, laledet, to beget, and tafil, which here is being translated as give you birth. But used in contexts that aren't talking about giving birth, because Hebrew has a small word economy, words are used to mean lots of different things. So the NRSV gives us for Isaiah 26:18, like a woman with a child about to give birth writhes and cries out in her pain, so were we because of you, O Lord. Translating laledet, beget, as give birth, and tachil, which we had as bear you, gives birth to you, whatever, as writhes in labor. Totally different. Same verb pairing, the same parallelism as our verse from Deuteronomy. Why do translators not use the same words to translate it? So literally, if we, again, correct the translation for the words we have in front of us, You gave up the rock who bore you, and you forgot the God who writhed in labor for you. Writhed in labor. Yahweh isn't just giving birth or creating you. Yahweh is writhing in labor for you. No way, Yahweh. Okay, so again, we keep asking this question, where did the goddesses go? Nowhere. They are not personally present, right? This is where we start to get into the intricacies of theology. We don't worship, as Jews and Christians, we don't worship Asherah. But their aspects creep onto the entities that we, or the entity that we do worship. And the aspect creep is a very technical, nerdy way of saying sort of that their clothing gets lent to the religion of the next generation. So we could also say that the essence of the goddesses is gone, their personhood is gone, but their clothing is not. It has been put onto Yahweh, or as I like to say, Yahweh is now in drag. Okay, we'll stop there. It's a lot.
Almost the sentence before the glow from you. That's very startling to think of. Could you bring back the one just before? You gave up. So I understand on the Asherah side what is being lost, the barriers of food. But to give up the rock before you, meaning the Yahweh side, what is being surrendered?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is really, I mean, this is a tochacha, like a rebuke of the Israelite people that Moses gives for going after false gods. At the same time, it is sort of encoding the conflation of Yahweh and Asherah into each other, where the idea of Yahweh giving birth is really weird until you get to the Bible, because Yahweh is a male deity. But once you get to the Bible, Yahweh starts taking on these aspects of giving birth, opening the womb. When, Hannah doesn't pray to Asherah when she wants to give birth to a child who'll be Samuel. She prays to Yahweh, right? Yahweh becomes a god of fertility. And so there's a lot of things being given up here. If this is being directed at us, if we imagine that we're the audience for this verse, maybe it's talking about the times where we've gone astray from our relationship with God, but I think it's also suggesting at a deeper level that it's calling us away from giving up the femininity of God, that actually that we have given up the parts of God that writhed in labor for us. And we're not really monotheists if we give those parts up either, right? A broken God is not a one God. And so if we're missing pieces of God's personhood from that are biblical completely, never mind all the ancient statues or whatever, but what the Bible says, then do we know God if those parts are missing?
Temporarily search because.
Yeah. I mean, and that wouldn't even be a problem for biblical Hebrew. That happened, that we have translations like that all over the Hebrew Bible. So you could read it as you gave up the rock who bore you because you forgot the God who writhed in labor for you. Yeah.
I wonder, does this idea exist, or is it concept that there is an all-pervading spirit that would pervade male gender and female gender, and that in the hierarchy of people someday, long time lost days, on the primacy of the male or the female, that this subsuming spirit would still be identified as male, but would be incorporating female functions?
It's sort of like the Bible represents a transitional point between polytheism and monotheism, which again are really a continuum. I think that what we see in the Bible as we look at the gender of God and how gender is talked about is a transition from this really sort of rigid male and female binary to these things exist, but they aren't actually separate. And I think by the time you get to Paul and Galatians 3, which is the most quoted biblical passage for me, you get to this place where there is neither male nor female in Christ Jesus, for all are one. that isn't Paul saying that people aren't male or female. It's Paul saying that I, as an individual, am not male or female. I have masculine traits, but I exist on a continuity of gender that is a oneness within Christ. And so it really does seem like what Paul's doing is not, it wasn't his idea, right? He's taking it from this tradition of our male God actually writhes in labor. So that's really, I think, a lot of people that are into ancient religion are kind of bummed about monotheism. They're like, look at what we lost, all this, culture and the statues and the incense, and it's hard to be a Protestant, but but it's not gone. And there are benefits to monotheism, and I think one of them is when you have one deity that has created all and made all in that deity's image, you can't actually hold on to the idea for very long that that deity is only male. You can't. It doesn't make sense. And right in Genesis, when it says that, when God is using we, by the way, as a pronoun, and God says we shall create, human beings in our likeness and in our image, it immediately says male and female. So there's no doubt that masculinity and femininity are part and parcel of the image of God right from the beginning. It's just, it took us 3,000 years to sort it all out. Yes.
That seems like an odd image.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Why is God a rock? Yeah. I wish I had a lot more to say about it because it's very curious to me. It's not something I've directly studied. I have some imaginings about where it could have come from. A lot of the patriarchs in the Torah are sort of using stones to mark places where they encounter God, and I sort of wonder if those places of worship become conflated with what's being worshipped. So, this is the rock on which I set up my church, right? Sometimes we think of the rock as Peter or the Pope if we're Catholic, and other times it's Christ, right? Christ is the rock upon which the church is built. And so I wonder if maybe there was some sort of phasing that into part of the identity of God from how God was being worshipped. But I have no idea. I honestly don't know. Oh, the rock is fertile here. Yeah, what's up with that? Well, think of the imagery, think of what rocks do though in Exodus and Numbers. Rocks have water spewing out of them. We get honey from a rock, right? Like those kind of metaphors that are present in the Torah might also, and in the prophets might give some sort of, yeah. Haley. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it seems to me like we're looking at the discrepancies. I'm crazy. Oh, sure. When you look at the two discrepancies between Yahweh and what was yes. I was just wondering, like, as that person describing it, they actually just thought to themselves, oh well, yeah, I mean, they belong together, like, they're not separate in the way that, that we might imagine them to be separate.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm wondering if they have the same vibe that we hold now around, like, ascribing these different names to God, or if for the scribes at that time, it was just like, this is the representation of this God that I worship.
I think that as we see the Josianic reforms sort of take root in the Bible with passages like this where we can see scribal corrections added to the text, that the fear is not of how they're representing God. The fear is the king is going to chop my head off. Like there is a pressure on this process that can't be ignored. There's a power present in the text that can't be ignored. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the scribes who wrote down the Hebrew Bible were trained in Ugarit, like were trained in Canaanite scribal centers. We just We just don't have an Israelite scribal center to look to and say, oh yeah, here's all the practice tablets where they learned how to write the alphabet. We have, 100 miles north, some scribal centers where it's like, here's where all the scribes were trained. And in my mind, the Canaanite nature of the Hebrew Bible shows us that these scribes were really trained in this, right? And so in my mind, I can't say for sure, and no one can, but in my mind, I think they're saying, we're going in this direction. This is where Israelite religion is going. We're becoming Jews, right? This is where what Judaism is becoming. How do we carry her with us? And they're finding ways that are actually creative and I imagine somewhat intentional, to hold on to the more complicated divine reality that they see. I mean, we just don't, when we read the Bible in English, we just don't see it. Every time you see the word God in the Bible, you're actually looking at the word Elohim, which refers not directly to the personhood of God, but to God's divine counsel. So you're seeing God acting in the collective whenever you see the word God in the Hebrew Bible. And that's just something that a Hebrew reader sees every single time they see Elohim, and an English reader sees God. And God is really complicated in the Hebrew Bible. God is weird in the Hebrew Bible. God is writhing in labor in the Hebrew Bible, and that's something that I think we have lost in translation. Oh, so well, okay, so yeah, Adonai is just Lord in Hebrew, and that name is just smashed onto the text in reading because there's a taboo in Judaism about pronouncing Yahweh, and so they don't pronounce Yahweh anymore. There's a long story about that also leads to the pronunciation Jehovah, which is in error, but yeah, long story.
This may or may not be the time. So is this the moment when we were once talking about 6 genders, flesh and sex, but this is the time to insert that?
So Jewish law has 6 sexes that it recognizes apart from male and female. And those are real things that the Talmud is describing, but we would call them intersex conditions today. So there's a lot of people like to look at that and say, oh, Judaism has 8 genders, or Judaism has, depending on how you count them, 6 or 7 genders. But really, Judaism has an awareness of intersex conditions. It's not really the same way that we think about gender today. That's in the Talmud, so that comes about anywhere from 300 to 500 years AD. But yeah, it is an interesting topic, and I do sometimes wonder if the way that Judaism deals with gender, especially Jewish mysticism deals with gender, is related to this kind of conflation, that when you're reading in Hebrew, you can actually see that God has a complicated relationship with gender. I'm not just coming up here to tell you that God is non-binary, but, works for me. Okay. So let's talk about how the goddesses have resurfaced, and I'm going to try to get us done for 4:30. Okay. We'll start with Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystical tradition, and we're going to look at a text called the Zohar. The Zohar is a Jewish mystical text from medieval Spain, like the 13th, 14th century. It's written in Aramaic, but no one in medieval Spain actually spoke Aramaic, so it's written in a really weird, clunky Aramaic that doesn't seem to always have grammar rules. Rather, it definitely has gender rules, and they play with them a lot. But it's a very long text. Buying a translation is like 16 volumes, and it really is a commentary on the Torah that reads the Torah as if it is sort of a map of the body of God, as opposed to a story. It reads it as like, here's the powers within God and what they're doing. So it looks at this verse from the Torah, Deuteronomy 16:21, you shall not plant any tree as a sacred pole, in Hebrew Asherah, beside the altar that, Asher is the Hebrew word for that, by the way, you make for the Lord Yahweh your God. And they ask the question in the Zohar, so if you can't plant a tree beside the altar, is it okay somewhere else? And that might seem silly, right? But if you think about it, and you think about critiques of monotheism today, a lot of people say you shall have no other gods before me, literally means you shall have no other gods in my presence. But if you're not in my presence, then it's fine. And so it sounds silly, but 700 years ago, people were thinking about that question. So the Zohar says, can you plant an Asherah somewhere else? And they say, no, you cannot. So then why does the Torah specify that beside the altar that you make for God in the temple, you shall not plant an Asherah tree? Well, they say this has to do with the name of Yahweh itself. So here's the name Yahweh in Hebrew at the top, and this is also the same letters in the middle and at the bottom. And in the Jewish mystical tradition, there's different ways to break down the letters. The second line is the same letters. It's Yahweh, just rearranged. The letters on the right-hand side, Yud and Vav, are considered to be masculine. And you can see why, right? Like they're kind of phallic. Or really, the Yud would represent kind of semen and the Vav phallus. And so the Hey, both of the Heys in the name, represent the feminine side of God, representing the womb that then receives the seed to conceive. And you even have mystical Jewish art where the Yud, representing the seed, is placed inside of the Hey, representing the womb, as a name of God. And the Hebrew name of God, Yah, which is a shortened form of Yahweh. If you know any Rastafarians, that's their favorite one. Jah, right? Yah. Is actually just Yud and Hey together, that still representing the masculine and feminine together. But there's also another way to see it that that the Yud, Hey, and Vav, which spell Yahu, which is the ancient name of Yahweh, probably pre-Israelite name of Yahweh. Why would you add a Hey? Like you don't actually need the Hey at the end to say the name. So why add it? And the Zohar will say, well, actually, this is Asherah. The final Hey of the name of God is Asherah. And sometimes they'll call her a different name, like Shekhinah, which is the feminine presence of God in the Hebrew mystical tradition. And it describes any time in the Bible where you see God's glory, right? That's the Shekhinah, that's the feminine presence of God. And they say, actually, it's Asherah, right in the Zohar, medieval Spain, monotheistic Jews. And so what they come up with is that actually the rule is not to plant another Asherah in addition to the one Asherah who's already present in Yahweh at the altar, which the text calls Asher. Now, in Hebrew, Asher just means that, right? It's just a particle, right? It doesn't really have any meaning in the text. But what they're saying is actually that the altar is the masculinization of Asherah, and that the text isn't saying that, it's actually saying you shouldn't plant any tree as an Asherah beside Asher you make for the Lord. It's saying that there's a masculine and feminine side to God that's really unified in Yahweh. And if you take her out and plant an Asherah tree, that's idolatry. The problem isn't that Asherah is part of the personhood of God. The problem is when you split God into pieces. That's not okay. Now we have to ask the question, but like, how did they even know about this? Like, that makes so much sense with everything we know that I think, as Faith said earlier, these are recent discoveries. Like, we didn't know about Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, 200 years ago the way that we do now. So they knew that she was a goddess. They knew from the Bible that she was represented by a tree that was either planted next to the altar in the temple or stood next to the altar in the temple. They know that ancient Israelites worshipped her. They did not know that she was considered the consort or the wife of Yahweh. So they're taking the text that is available to them, which is just the Bible, really, and they're actually kind of excavating Asherah as the consort of Yahweh out from the biblical text without any of the archaeological stuff that we just went through. Now you're probably wondering, Joshua, why did you subject us to that then? We could have just read the Bible. Then there's the issue of the Queen of Heaven. So remember that this verse from the passage in Jeremiah 7, the women need dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. So let's look at a Christian example of the goddess under the surface. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Doesn't that sound familiar now? Writhing in labor. Now, who is that? There's a lot of debate among theologians who this woman is in Revelation. Some people say that's Israel, as in the people of Israel, God's wife in the Hebrew Bible, for example, in Hosea. So God even has a wife after Asherah, just only metaphorically. It's the people of Israel. Some people say it's the church, who is described as the wife of Christ in the New Testament, especially in Ephesians 5, which isn't a very fun text, but talk about misogyny, but the church is described as the bride of Christ there. Again, so now Christ has a wife all of a sudden. And the Catholic Church describes this as a vision of Mary, whom St. Augustine of Hippo in Sermon 208 calls the mother and spouse of God. So you can see there's this thing creeping through, right? There's this aspect creep of God having a consort, having a wife in many different ways. If you were to ask me, like, okay, Joshua, which one do you think it is? I would say it's all of them, like all of it. So here's the image that, if you've ever had a Catholic prayer card, that's, there you go. Mary, standing on the moon. The sun is the halo behind her head. Also, not for nothing, she has a vulva behind her, right? Like that's what that is. This is vulva behind her. It's called a mandorla, and that shape that is behind saints and behind Mary, it is a vulvic image. I mean, there's really, and it makes sense, right? She is the womb through which God incarnates. So what do we put behind her? The vehicle of incarnation. When Jesus resurrects from the dead and we draw a picture of it, what do we put behind him? The womb is the tomb, right? Like you put a giant vulvic symbol behind him because Jesus is being reborn into life in the resurrection. And there's supposed to be 12 stars up there. I think the artists are carried away and there's more, but I just wanted to show you how in the Catholic iconography this is represented. But it's more than just images. These are some titles of Mary that are given to her in the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Some of them we'll be familiar with, some will be a little surprising. Mother of God, Virgin Mary. She's called the New Eve, which ties her back to the story of Eden, where you have a snake in a tree, right? Which is a symbol of Asherah. She's called the Star of the Sea. That's very Asherah-like. Our Lady, God-bearer, Holy Mary, Queen of Heaven, Queen of Angels, Throne of Wisdom, Ark of the Covenant, Mother of the Church, Queen of the World, Mystical Rose, Gate of the Dawn, just in case our understanding of Asherah's name is the other one, right? The other possibility, Gate of the Dawn, Queen of the Holy Ones, or Saints. Saints just means holy ones. Mediatrix of all graces, life-giving spring, and the Queen, this is an Orthodox title that is just like so, chef's kiss. The Queen by the right side of the King. So go back to Deuteronomy. Who's at the right side of the king? Well, the Orthodox say, it's Mary. Asherah, Mary, there's a relationship there. But then there's also the issue of, does the femininity of God actually come through Jesus? And this is one that a lot of people have a hard time with. They like to see Jesus as masculine entirely, but throughout church history, that has not been the case. We have to start way back in the Hebrew Bible, Proverbs, with wisdom. Chokhmah in Hebrew and Sophia in Greek. Does not wisdom call and understanding raise her voice? The Lord, and then she says later on in the passage, the Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. So who is that, right? Who's this wisdom lady? Now, Philo, who is a first century Jewish philosopher, is writing about wisdom. And he said that wisdom is represented by as one of the beings of the divine company, speaking of herself in this manner. One of the beings of the divine company. So Philo has a concept of a divine company, which is already pretty interesting. And this is 2,000 years ago, right? And she says, God created me as the first of his works. It's the verse that we just read. For it was necessary that all things which came under the head of the creation must be younger than the mother and nurse of the whole universe. Now the universe has a mother and a nurse. And that's apparently wisdom. In his treatise on allegorical interpretation, God planted a paradise in Eden. There he placed the man whom he had formed, for he called that divine and heavenly wisdom by many names, and he made it manifest that it had many appellations, for he called it the beginning and the image and the sight of God, referring to the creation of humanity as the image and the likeness of God. And then later says, but the most universal of all things is God. And in the second place, the word of God. This is where the idea of logos comes from, right? The word. But other things have an existence only in word. Now, he thought other things only have an existence in word, but John did not. So when John was writing, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, he's taking what Philo wrote, actually. I mean, this is scholarly consensus now, that John is actually basing his work on Philo and saying, not only is the word from God, a part of God, but actually is God, because he's going to claim, of course, that Christ is God. And all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Well, all of a sudden, we have a male Logos and a male Jesus. What happened to Sophia? Here's a little bit more of what she said. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker. Sophia is not just wisdom, is not just there. She's participant in the creation. And the word in Hebrew here for worker also means nurse, which is why Philo says that she was the nurse of creation. So Proverbs tells us of a feminine wisdom present before and at creation, participant in creation. Philo identifies wisdom with word. John identifies the word with Jesus Christ. And then we might want to know, is there anywhere in the New Testament where the authors actually seem conscious of the femininity of Christ? And there is, in Matthew. Jesus says, this is on the triumphal entry to Jerusalem, 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 the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I have desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Now you might say, oh, that's a nice metaphor, Joshua, but it's not Jesus identifying as a woman. Here's the problem. There's a lot of really nice gathering metaphors from the Hebrew Bible that are masculine. Jesus chooses intentionally, I think, a mother metaphor here, a hen who gathers her brood under her wings. And in Jerusalem, there is a mosaic. It's a modern mosaic, but this is Jesus as a mother hen gathering the children under her wings. Sorry?
What would be how dated?
This is modern. This is maybe in the past century. Yeah. It's at like an obscure church in Jerusalem. I don't remember which one, but there were a lot of churches there. So Julian of Norwich was also not unaware of the motherhood of Jesus. And she said things like this about Jesus. Now, she didn't know anything about Asherah, and she didn't know about the resurfacing of the Israelite goddesses, right? She didn't have any of that information. She probably had access to very little information at all. But she saw Jesus this way. And our substance is our Father, God Almighty, and our substance is our Mother, God All-Wisdom, and our substance is in our Lord, the Holy Spirit, God All-Goodness. So there's a very different Trinity than we're used to. For our substance is whole in each person of the Trinity, which is one God. As truly as God is our Father, God is also our Mother, and he shows this in all. And especially in the sweet words where he says, I am. That is to say, I am the might and the goodness of fatherhood. I am the wisdom of motherhood. I am the light and the grace that is all blessed love. I am the Trinity. I am the unity. I am the sovereign goodness of all manner of things. And thus is Jesus our very mother in our being by our creation, and he is our very mother in grace by partaking in our created nature. All the fair working and all the sweet kindly office of divine motherhood is seen in the second person. For in him we have this goodly flesh garment and endless satiety, both in being and grace of his own proper goodness. So both because we exist and because we are saved, Jesus is our mother. Well, she's using endless satiety to describe the beatific vision. So she's describing this a state of grace, being in a state of grace. And Julian is not some obscure, weird mystic, right? Like these passages are quoted by the Roman Catholic Catechism. So she's seen as an institutional contributor to the tradition. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church actually defines God as mother because of her work. Okay. There's a few things that we can do with this information, and we're just wrapping up now. One option is reconstruction, which is we should just go back to worshiping the goddesses, right? Like bring it on, erect an incense altar and put up a tablet of stone. Let's do it. There are people who do that. One of my personal friends is Tess Dawson, who is the founder of Natib Kaddish, the Canaanite Reconstructionist movement. It's literally a group of people who worships the Canaanite gods. And they use texts like the ones we saw today to reconstruct their religious worship. Another option is, of course, okay, the final sentence there is good. We wouldn't really be Jews and Christians anymore, right? Like if Jews and Christians do this, that's the undoing of monotheism. The other option is reconciliation. We can honor our traditions while still recognizing that they come from somewhere, right? And that they developed over time, accepting the entire thrust of history, goddesses and all. And this is still borderline because there's still a recognition of, well, we used to be polytheists and now we're not. So we can honor that we used to be polytheists. Still kind of hard to grasp from as a fervent monotheist myself. But there are movements for this too. Kohenet is a Jewish program where they really try to bring back the material culture of the goddesses without sort of steering off of the Jewish course. And so, they might say Asherah, and by that they mean God. They're not worshiping Asherah, the separate deity from Yahweh. Still borderline. Here's the third option. I think we need a reassessment of how we see God, and I think that this is part of it. We could understand that the aspects of the goddesses conflate into Yahweh's personhood as types and shadows, right? We have that phrasing in our tradition. We didn't eliminate divine femininity. It was incorporated into the whole picture of God, and without it, we're missing something that we need to know about God. We don't need to worship or recognize in any particular way the individual aspects of that whole personhood, because God is already whole and perfect, as God is, and as we know her, perhaps, in Scripture and the breaking of bread. Thanks.